Ben Van Voorst in the Department of Pediatrics, but trained in internal medicine pediatrics and doing risk prevention research and preventing mental disorders in children. And so become very interested in the phenomenon of these common diseases like depression, hypertension, and to sort of watch this field develop, and was fascinated by this polygenic risk prediction index, which gets around the reality that for many of our common diseases, there's no one single mutation. There's probably a chorus of genes, and even if we don't know how they're all interacting, we can produce robust prediction indexes. And I wondered, it sounds like you've done some work, pretty advanced work already with a polygenetic risk prediction index for cardiovascular disease. But I wondered, is that occurring across many of the other common diseases that within 5 or 10 years, we're going to have polygenic risk prediction indexes for many common diseases that will help us risk stratify people more adroitly and shape or choose the right intensity of preventive intervention, maybe even in childhood for things like hypertension or depression or other common chronic diseases.
Yeah, I mean, Matt can probably speak to this more than I can. I mean, polygenic risk scoring came out of the neurogenetics field, really. I mean, the first publications were in schizophrenia, I believe, looking at polygenic risk across common variation to predict risk for schizophrenia. And there's been a lot of really fascinating work within neuropsychiatric genetics, looking at taking polygenic risk scores for a certain disorder and then actually using that to predict something else, and to basically teasing out the overlap in the genetic architecture that underlies those. You can do the same thing in cardiovascular disease. You can take a genetic risk score for LDL cholesterol that robustly predicts risk for coronary disease. The inverse is not necessarily true. So again, coronary disease risk is beyond LDL. It's a component, but it includes beyond LDL. So you can use it actually, it's quite interesting. You can use it to actually inform your understanding of biology in terms of the genetic architecture that underlies traits and how those are shared. And then you can use it to predict risk for a variety of conditions.
I think our understanding of polygenic risk score modeling is very early days. I think it has utility, but it's I put a warning there. There's a missing information issue. So most of this is built upon SNPs and that are high frequency in populations. It's not built on, for example, whole genome sequencing. It's not built on all of the information that there might be in terms of, say, interactions between proteins or mathematically between dominant effects or recessive effects or whether the effects are additive or multiplicative or subtractive. So the modeling, I think, is very naive. I think there's a huge missing data piece because we've only got, for example, SNP arrays, or there's a polygenic risk score, for example, for Alzheimer's disease based on 33 SNPs. And I think while it has maybe some utility, I wouldn't put a lot of kudos on using that to inform myself or others that they may or may not get dementia at late life.
And then I think the biggest missing piece, of course, is non-European populations.
Yeah.
So we're only as good as the training data that we have. For coronary disease, there's been GWAS in 100,000 individuals of European ancestry. The largest published case control analysis of coronary disease in African Americans consisted of 800 cases. And so we just don't have an ability to use those scores robustly across all populations right now.
I'm going to press my last luck and ask one more conceptual question. I think what we see over the life course, those of us who are looking more at the environment and behavioral, you might say, is that clustering of adverse traits and characteristics, for want of a better term, that result in non-random association of things like depression, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity in middle-aged people. And one thing, as a pediatrician, I've been fascinated with, is there sort of like an arc people start out on, maybe with a genetic origin, where there's actually a clustering of risk factors for these diseases of modernity that are now being expressed in the civilizational culture that we have, that actually interrelate and kind of have reciprocal causation with the environment. Is there a group of people that particularly is adversely impacted by modernity based on some sort of now revealed set of genetic variations, basically?
So I do think, so I'm going to take from my work on obesity. So I do think you're right that there are individuals that essentially where they are, they're stratified to be relative rank order within a population in a given exposure, both in terms of nutritional exposure and physical activity exposure. So, and there are people that have been selected, as you're alluding to, over centuries and beyond to have thrifty genes, right, that we're helping them in terms of conserving energy in times of famine, that have now had the opposite effect in terms of in times of lots of availability of food, predispose them to obesity. And as obesity is a risk factor for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, it sort of gets bundled all together. I think that's what you're talking about, and there are definitely common variants like that and probably even more rare variants that are like that as well.
Hi, I was wondering, do you allow researchers to use your database and Ancestry, like to ask some questions? Because, to get this kind of genetic data, in terms of a NIH grant or something would almost be impossible.
So we do take research applications on a case-by-case basis. We shared the topology of the network with the Nature Communication paper. That information is available. And we have an ongoing collaboration, but it is a case-by-case basis. I can share my email with you. Yeah, definitely. We have it would be like our public relations department. It would be a great start, but I will share my email. I should have put it on the slide. I'm sorry.
I also have a question for the Ancestry over here.
Where are you?
Yes.
Okay. Hi.
So it looked like on your reference database, Australia was not included. Is that true? And why would that be?
Because it is included. We are identifying communities in Australia. A lot of the communities in Australia, as you would guess, are highly enriched for British ethnicity. It probably was maybe a earlier version. We're always working to identify new communities.
So this question might be for Wendy, but anyone else. You suggested that the right time to do screening, at least at newborn, is when there's someone who presents with something. And I guess I want to challenge you and say, given what we've heard even this morning around cardiovascular disease, cancer, obesity, all these other things, that the number of times that we would want to be able to interrogate I would even go farther than an exome, a genome, during the course of someone's lifetime, why not just start out and get that on everybody to start with? I know we don't know how to pay for that interrogation right now, but it seems to me that we're using this over and over again, and why aren't we thinking about that?
So this experiment is in progress, and I think the results have been somewhat unexpected. Some of you in the room probably know this. So NICHD had paid actually for a newborn sequencing study to be able to try this out, so it's being done in several different places. If Robert Green were here himself, he would be able to say this, but that when they've done this in terms of BabySeq at the Boston Children's, the Brigham to do this, he was expecting that something like 65–70% of parents would actually agree to do that. As it's turned out, it's been like single digits in terms of parents who wanted to do this. So it's not, even when you offer it, I think there's some concern about what you can or can't learn from this, as well as some issues about discrimination, I think are one of the biggest concerns. I think it's one of these things where you also have to pair this. So the question is, in a time where we can't completely utilize the information in ways that we'd want to, is now the time to do it? Or do you wait until the cost of sequencing and interpretation come down and then invest your resources at that point? I guess the point that I'm making is the low-hanging fruit are kids or adults, I don't care, but something who's symptomatic, who's actually sick, goodness gracious, let's get on with that part of it at least.
Right. So just as a quick follow-up, and again, if anyone else has any comments, I'm at the Brigham and Women's, so
I'm sorry.
I work with Robert and others, and how much of it do you think is an education problem? And Robert and I have had this discussion before about people just really not appreciating what the long-term value is, and that's our fault
So I
the
would-
medical community's fault for not providing the right education.
So I'll push back on you, and you know this better than I do because you're there. I would argue that those patients are even more educated, probably by about 2 degrees, than the average person in the general population. And if anything, they're more educated and concerned about what this could do, and they don't, I'll be honest, the feedback I've gotten from the genetic counselors and the coordinators is when you start talking about that goes in your medical record, then that's a different discussion in terms of, you know, potentially having this come back to bite you in some way. We could be.
I guess there's a few layers though, right? I mean, there's things that are clinically actionable now. And then I think what you're alluding to is, shouldn't we just have genetic information available so that I want to prescribe a drug and it has an FDA black box warning and I can just look at the genetic information that's been generated at some time prior. And that's quite complicated when you move throughout health systems across the country, different payers, different systems. I mean, it's very complicated to understand how certainly the clinical actionable things get into the chart, but everything else doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, just to throw something out there to be provocative, I can imagine, for instance, that you're going to have your data, your exome, your genome in the cloud. You're going to have a cloud account that's going to be able to iteratively look at that. You're going to have a credit card with a chip embedded in it that's going to have your health information plus your genomic information. You're going to go to the pharmacy to get something filled. You're going to swipe in just like you pay for something now, figure out pharmacogenetically wise whether or not this is the right dose. The infrastructure to build that, though, has to be built, and that's not available currently. It is, as a conceptual thing, possible.
And I think just one point, actually, as a provocative point, is that we know that, you know, on top of both environmental exposure and through time, you know, our genes can have damaged DNA and things change. And so I think that, you know, kind of what is truly more valuable, actually, if a patient actually through those types of selection, develop the phenotype, or kind of from the beginning. And I would query that if, you know, if it is actually economically feasible, developing a monitoring type of process would probably lead the most comprehensive way to look at this.
Yeah, so just to point out, there's a number of countries now involved in national efforts to generate such data. Obviously in the UK, for example, and to link that to the National Health System records and to do that for tens or hundreds of thousands of individuals and to allow that data to be ethically shared with globally. So I think it would probably behoove nation states to do this. I think the US should be one of the leading ones doing it, but it has a problem. It has a payer problem, insurance company problem, perhaps, and to nationalize it. I think Canada might be it might be easier in some senses to get it done there, but for each of these nation states to do that and then to try and take on this sharing problem, global sharing problem, to maintain patient anonymity in some senses and privacy, and yet be able to share the information about the genetic variability, to correlate that with clinical signs and symptoms, to be able to share that with other physicians, for physicians who have patients like that with similar findings. It's a big challenge. And it's page one of Genesis kind of thing, right? So it's going to be exciting times, that's for sure.
So to follow up on that, Matt Redenbaugh from UNC Chapel Hill. So I think our country here in the U.S. just learned just a few months ago that healthcare is really complicated, and we never knew that. But we now really know that. But I want to follow up on this with respect to having genetic screening and in place in terms of the perception that you may have to disclose that as a pre-existing condition. So can any of you comment on that, either from the ancestry point of view or from the sort of basic or clinical science point of view?
I'll start. So I think many people know there is a federal law in place, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects your health insurance in terms of your rates raised being denied insurance based on that. It has holes in it, though. So, for instance, if you're in the military, it doesn't apply to you. It doesn't protect you in terms of disability, life insurance, long-term care insurance, employment discrimination. I think there are some concerns that there's some subtle discrimination that can still happen, even though it may not be overt. And I think people, at least when you talk about completely predictive and sort of a vast unknown. People get concerned about that, and at least I can just tell you from what I hear from patients, within right now the shifting sands that they're feeling in Washington, they're feeling quite uneasy in terms of the confidence that this is going to continue to be in place. But others can certainly comment.
I mean, I guess just to speak from an ancestry point of view, our utmost, number one important thing is data privacy and protecting your genomic information, right? We now have 6 million people's genomic information. It's always completely anonymized for us, but it goes back to, the data sharing agreements and those kind of things. This is your genetic data, and we really don't want to share it or put it in a compromised situation at all.
Hi there, over here. My name is Emmy Pett. I'm from Stanford. I have two kind of unrelated questions. My first question is, as we move toward pay-for-play or customer-oriented genetic services being the vast majority contributor to reference databases, how do we ensure that we end up having reference databases that represent minority and underserved populations? So what are some practical steps that we can take to ensure that we cover underrepresented populations? My second question is, recently there was this publication invoking this omnigenic model of inheritance, and I'd be curious to hear some of the panel members' thoughts on that model.
I'll say for the first one, it hasn't really come up so much, but All of Us, as I think everyone knows, is the US version, at least in terms of dealing with precision medicine, and is meant to be 1 million Americans, broadly representative. Exactly how we operationalize that is not completely clear, but it certainly is part of the mission. For those of us who have been involved in NHGRI or National Human Genome Research grants that are coming forward, we're specifically, NHGRI is right now targeting many of these to be specifically underrepresented minority in at least 65% of those genomic studies, broadly defined in many dimensions. But so I think those are the initiatives on the government side, at least for being able to do that. I think a large part of this, honestly, is for all of us who are in this room, which is that it's not simply a matter, there's a trust issue, I think, with a large trust and access in terms of being able to have everyone involved. So I do think a lot of the studies, for instance, that I do now take away some of the access issues by making things online, working on what Ancestry's done with saliva as a method for donating online. Although there is an online divide, more people have smartphones, so I do think they're a way of engaging more people that way. But I do think there are certain communities where there's still a trust issue in terms of someone having their DNA or their information. And I think it has to come from people in the community to both educate, as I think we talked about before, but to also ensure that the communities are represented at the table as these research studies are being devised. The governance is there, being very transparent.
I think for Ancestry, I mean, in the field of genetics and precision medicine as a whole, right, I think we can all agree it's been pretty Eurocentric work. And it's definitely something very important to us to make sure that we have a very representative database moving forward, and it is definitely on our radar as something we care greatly about.
There's a huge need to have underrepresented populations included because of genetic diversity that they may contribute to a human genome reference map is absolutely enormous. Every time I sequence an individual and I see twice as much genetic variability, I automatically assume that they're African, Ethiopian. There's some background difference there, and it's more likely to be African if there's more genetic variability. But there's a problem as well. I mean, I think there's a huge scientific need and demand and interest, and I think your point was very well said. But this forum is about precision health and precision medicine, right? So one thing is about identifying genetic variability that may predispose to health and disease. Another is to use that information to develop new medications and therapies for those particular individuals and stratify clinical trials, et cetera, and bring that to the clinic. But the third biggest problem is how do you then provide those medications, for example, to those underrepresented minorities, to those ethnic groups that maybe have contributed hugely to the data set in the first place. I have this very specific problem in North Africa in Berbers, all the way from Morocco to Egypt, where we found that 30%, as I pointed out, of Parkinson's patients have this specific mutation that I know a LRRK2 kinase inhibitor will treat. But how can we make that affordable to Berbers in that in that part of the world. And I haven't got a satisfactory explanation or answer for that. So it's more than just sharing as part of this information gathering exercise, but it's also the delivery, how we're going to deliver back to those communities.
I think that's a very important point in cancer therapy, where we've had drugs actually that have been FDA approved for about 10 years and yet are still not accessible in other countries. And certain populations across those countries actually have high, distribution of that specific genotype with that variant. And so I think kind of, there are many stakeholders in this situation, and I think that figuring out strategies to align stakeholders in ways that, people can come together, I think is very important. Also, as we're dealing with very small populations of patients, I think a big thing that we're going to have to work on as a field is collaboration to aggregate, these data sets across country, and even institutions, within the same country. And I think in cancer, we see this a lot about how, people can, because no single entity can kind of drive this effort.
So I think your second question, if I still remember it, was about Jonathan Pritchard's recent work, which is now the idea that really there's a big hairball, essentially. All phenotypes are matched to all genotypes, and it's one big sort of gamush. And I guess I do worry that there is some amount of truth to that. I'm not sure it's quite as complicated as that, but that once you get to things where the relative risk ends up being very, very small, that you are talking about things that are more of this, what we talked about earlier, sort of predisposition to positive energy balance or things like that, that then have other myriad effects downstream. So I guess one of the things that I noticed this morning, at least from 3 of us, is that some of us are focusing on relatively rare variants, or at least proportion of what we've done is rare variants, but of large effect size. And I do worry about when you get to some of these GWAS studies when you're talking about an odds ratio of 1.02 or something like that, you're not really, I don't know, either using it for good risk stratification nor identifying interesting biology that's either druggable or all that useful in terms of understanding the pathways of the networks. So I guess I tend to be on the side of at least getting things that are more both robust as well as more impactful to really see the biology that's underneath there that's meaningful.
We have to go for the low-hanging fruit.
That's right.
First.
First.
Yeah.
So I think we're gonna.
Okay, I guess it is lunch break.
It is lunch break. They're hungry, I think. A round of applause for just a fantastic group of talks. And I'd love to continue.